Kids who never learned to read are graduating from high school. Illiterate students are heading off to college, and while facing criticism of failing American kids, the Department of Education is being folded. Authority on public schools, it's actually shifting back to the states. And all of this is stirring up a new debate. Where did public schools go wrong? But can they be fixed? An even bigger issue hangs overhead though. What if the foundation of the public school system was actually meant to fail in the first place? How do you fix this? Now, some of these problems actually go back to the root of the modern education system. The history ties in with odd communist experiments in the United States, the failed communes of the early 1800s, history not many people know about. Those ideas from those communes went on to influence the systems of education in Prussia. Those were designed to condition kids to be little more than factory workers. And these two systems, well, they fed into key elements of the modern public education system. Now, one of the key historians on this is author and journalist Alex Newman.
The first guy that seriously proposed that the government ought to be educating our children was a guy who publicly claimed he was fighting what he called the great trinity of evil. This trinity of evil, he said, was marriage and family, private property, and what he called the irrational systems of religion. In particular, he was taking aim at Christianity. But he had the idea that you could fundamentally transform a society by transforming the hearts and minds of children through education.
Now, the guy he was referring to, that was Robert Owen. Robert Owen was born in 1771. He died in 1858. Now, this was long before the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 and what we come to know as modern communism. But when Owen was alive, this was a very different chapter of when the communist movements were first emerging in the world. This was alongside the many so-called red flag revolutions across Europe. This was just before the Paris Commune of 1871, which is regarded as the first time communism seized power. Now, in the United States at the time, communism took on a very different look from what was happening in Europe. Here, well, we weren't living under kings. And if somebody or a group of people wanted to go and start a communist experiment, they didn't have to do the March on Rome or, seize the Versailles. They were free to grab a piece of land anywhere they wanted and go and try it for themselves. And well, that's actually exactly what they did. These were the communes that they believed could create their own communist utopias. And they tried to do things like eliminating private property, eliminating religion, and eliminating families. Now, they tried putting in place systems where everything was owned by a state, and because they're kind of small, more like a micro-state. For kids and education, well, the idea was the kids did not belong to parents. Education was not on the parents. They belonged to the collective. Now, as you'd expect, all of these communes failed. Every one of them failed. And most only made it a few years, in fact. Typically what happened, they fell into chaos from leadership disputes, from debt, and just too many people deciding they just didn't feel like working hard when they didn't own what they worked for. Now, among these handful of communist groups was one called the Owenites that was under Robert Owen, and he built the New Harmony Commune in Indiana in 1825. He had some pretty extreme views, as you might expect. He wanted to create happiness, as he said. And in order to reach that happiness that he was trying to create, he said he had to get rid of private property, organized religion, and traditional family, and then submit to the state. Among his other plans was to take children from their parents, put them in a type of state-run childcare, and then have a new education system to shape the character of kids to become the desired citizens of that new utopia.
So Robert Owen believed a few very critical things. Right? He believed we needed to get rid of private property. He believed we needed to get rid of marriage and family. He very publicly argued that basically there should be no such thing as marriage. Men and women should kind of get together, have relations, and when they're tired of each other, just move on to the next one. And that children should be raised by the collective. And by the way, this is all before Karl Marx came on the scene.
Now, Robert Owen's commune only lasted 2 years. That was until 1827, before everything fell apart. But the ideas from it actually stuck around. That's where Prussia came in. The idea that the state could form a child into a desired, obedient citizen was something they really liked in Prussia at the time, because guess what? It was about obedience, military-style discipline. a complete loyalty indoctrinated towards the system. And unlike other schools of the time, it divided kids by age, the curriculum was state standardized, and rather than focus on things like critical thinking or religious morality, this focused on a recognition of authority. It was perfect for the new rise of industrialism, teaching little workers to follow the factory clock, sit still, and do their work quietly. And after that, well, the Owenite concept went to gestate in the Prussian model of authoritarianism, and then was imported back to the United States.
A few of the defining characteristics of that system would be widely recognizable today. You're going to segregate students by age, right? You're going to teach basically unquestioning adherence to authority. You're not going to be focusing primarily on religion or the Bible or anything like that. You're going to be basically training these people to be good little soldiers so that when the king orders you into battle, you go without question. So those were kind of the defining characteristics of the system that existed to instill obedience. The Prussian king was still kind of smarting from the loss of the war against Napoleon, and they thought, maybe if we could get these kids trained up and raised up in this new system, maybe they'll be better next time we end up in a war.
Now this is where another figure came in. That was Horace Mann, the so-called father of the common school, as they called him. Now, he went on a tour of Europe in 1843, and he thought the Prussian model system would be perfect for education back home in the United States. Be great for what he envisioned in Massachusetts in particular, a new system of common schools, funded by taxpayers, that could gradually move kids away from religious influence.
And so Horace Mann studies this system. And again, he acknowledged that this was being used by a dictatorship for sinister purposes. He publicly said that. But that is ultimately the system that he brought back to Massachusetts when he got himself selected as the first Secretary of Education. And he publicly said so. He just said, they're using it for dictatorial purposes. We're going to use it for good purposes because we're more enlightened. And so he said things like, we're going to get rid of 90% of the crime. Obviously, that didn't happen, right? But that's kind of the Prussian system. And then from Massachusetts, when Horace Mann was done there, he started traveling to other states and speaking to other legislatures, urging them to implement that same thing. And so when people say the Prussian system of so-called education is where it all starts, they're absolutely correct. That was the first real government education system, and that's what eventually was transplanted into the United States, and then the United States helped export that around the world.
Now, as time went on, that system went even further. It took inspiration from communist regimes. Among the key figures on that was John Dewey. He visited the Soviet Union in 1928. He saw how the regime ran its schools as state indoctrination centers, and he was delighted. He worked those influences into his so-called Humanist Manifesto in 1933. Now, he saw that public school system as the perfect place to institute a rejection of religion and to begin spreading his own concept in place of that, which was secular humanism.
When you look at the history, the documentation, the speeches, the books, the writings of the people who built the system, it's very clear that their goal was always to reshape the United States by reshaping, really capturing the hearts and minds of children. And they've been wildly successful. One of the guys who co-wrote this Humanist Manifesto with John Dewey, his name was Potter, he actually bragged in his book, Humanism, a New Religion, that they were going to use the public school system to propagate this new religion, humanism, which was essentially atheism, communism, masquerading as religion. And so it took some decades, right? He actually said in his book that the public schools were going to be the most powerful ally of humanism. And he mocked Christians. He said, what's your little Sunday school going to do with some of the children 1 hour a week when we've got them for 5 days to teach them humanism?
Now, to fully understand the context of how extreme this was, we need to talk about what education used to look like kind of in opposition to all of this. Classical education, older forms of schooling, especially in the United States. Even though the government didn't play much of a role in education here, the American people were actually some of the best educated and were among the most literate people in the entire world. Government
involvement in education only really began under the leadership of Horace Mann. So what did we have before that? Well, we primarily had what we would call today homeschooling. The bulk of education was happening around families' tables. Mom, dad, uncles, aunts, older siblings, grandma, grandpa, sometimes tutors or even neighbors if they had a particular specialty. And then, one-room schoolhouses where churches would basically come together teacher and hire one person to help teach the children. So this was a very, very different system than what was born starting in about the 1830s under Horace Mann. This was the Prussian system. So Horace Mann studied the Prussian system and then re-imported it here. And what that represented was a turning point. It was a usurpation of the traditional role of families and churches over the education of children.
And also, the American education system was very religious. Prayer was a normal part of school, so was reading the Bible, and that was basically the norm. That is, until the early 1960s. Religion at the time was mostly pushed out of public schools through 2 Supreme Court decisions. Now, the first case was Engel versus Vitale. That was 1962. And that was the main case that got rid of prayer in schools. It went after New York state laws at the time that used to open each day with a non-denominational prayer that recognized a God. Now, the court determined that having this practice in a public school, they said it violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That's basically the part that prevents government from interfering with religion. Now, the second case was a year later in 1963. That was Abington School District versus Schempp. And that pushed Bible reading mostly out of public schools and mainly stopped a practice where kids would recite the Lord's Prayer at the start of each school day. Now, the basis of that was also, they said it violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. But as religion was pushed out of public schools, something else was brought in. It was mainly the doctrine of secular humanism, this strange pseudo-religion of the Owenites and the vision of Robert Owen, who, in his own words, regarded Christianity in particular as part of his so-called Trinity of Evil.
This Trinity of Evil, he said, was marriage and family, private property, and what he called the irrational systems of religion. In particular, he was taking aim at Christianity, but he kind of had it out for any and all religions. We found out later, he gave a speech shortly before he died that he was getting his ideas from spirits, is what he said. But he had the idea that you could fundamentally transform a society by transforming the hearts and minds of children through education.
And all of this went along with the plans of Horace Mann. Even aside from prayer, the Bible actually used to be a core textbook used in schools. And Horace Mann wanted a system where that was no more.
What he argued was, we've got Presbyterians, we've got Anglicans, we've got Baptists, they have different doctrines on different issues. And, why don't we just save that for church on Sunday and we'll just let the schools focus on the so-called 3 R's, the reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Now, along with this also, the idea of secular humanism was actually very much replacing the religious foundations in the United States. Ironically, this, in some ways, just replaced a traditional religion with just another type of religion. But aside from all the debates around faith and belief, the real question of the modern school system is, well, is it making better kids? Is it making education better or worse? What are the effects?
Before the government took over education, Americans were by far the most highly educated people anywhere in the world, really in the history of the world. We had universal literacy in cities like Boston and Philadelphia, even in the hinterlands, out on the frontier, we had almost universal literacy.
And look, that's true also. Americans were even pretty well known for that. Literacy was even viewed by the Founding Fathers as a type of necessity for freedom. If you're going to have a representative democracy where people elect their own leaders, well, an informed public needs to be able to make informed decisions. That means you need to be well read. You don't have a free press without people reading newspapers. You don't have religious liberty without people being able to study their own faith. As things stand now, the quality of education is actually looking pretty bleak. According to the education news website The 74, which cited a 2023 National Center for Education Statistics study, it said 1 in 4 young adults across the US is functionally illiterate, yet more than half earned high school diplomas. Now, technically, that puts us at about the same level as the global average, which is not a good place to be for the United States. Also a very far cry from where the US used to stand. And it's even worse with other skills like problem solving. Americans have actually fallen even behind the global average. Now, in terms of fixing this, there's a lot of proposals going around. The Trump administration, they're working to reduce federal involvement. They think that's the way to go. They're giving more authority back to the states. Now, some think that school vouchers are the answer. That's where the state basically gives kids the equivalent money they'd use for public schools, and they can use it for other forms of schooling, like private schools or home schools or charter schools. For education expert Alex Newman and a lot of others, though, the solution may actually lie elsewhere.
It implies that the state is ultimately the one responsible for the education of children, when really parents ought to be the ones who are seen as responsible. I mean, we would all, I think, recoil in horror if the state said, we're going to feed your children and we're going to take your children to the doctor and we're going to take care of your children's dentistry. But when it comes to education, we're like, oh yeah, sure, you be in charge. Now, I think there's something to be said for certain forms of tax credits.
There's actually a good basis for that. If we go by UNESCO's 2022 Global Education Monitoring Report, which criticizes the rise of schools outside state control, they actually make it clear that funding for schools can also be used as a type of leverage over the schools.
They have publicly said in 2022, they put out the Global Education Monitoring Report, and the problem to be dealt with in this report was what they call the proliferation of non-state education providers. In other words, private schools, homeschools, and their solution to this alleged problem was to have the government step in and start financing the public school or the private schools and all the other alternative options. And they're very open about why they want to do that. They said, once we start funding them, we can tell them what they have to teach, what they have to test, who they can hire, who they can't. What could be more dangerous than that? Even forgetting everything else we've said today, we need to be very careful when we create systems like this that have the power to completely alter and transform an entire society.
We could argue historically that there's always been some form of public education with some degree of government involvement. Now, that's not always a bad thing because it establishes a baseline for education. The problem you have, though, is if someone wants to manipulate a centralized education system to either change the culture or impose their own, to alter religion or create a system of authoritarianism. And that's exactly what a lot of the people who formed the modern education system were doing, imposing their own beliefs while trying to eradicate the beliefs that they didn't like. But with all that said, what do you think the solution is? Maybe the answer is to just improve the public schools. Maybe there's a way to root out the influences of Horace Mann and Robert Owen. Maybe the answer is a shift to private schools, or maybe with new technologies, online learning could be the future. Let me know in the chat. And in the meantime, please don't forget to like this video and also subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so yet. Also, join me next time on The Josh Phillips Show.